You ever notice how, when you find a solution you really like, you start trying to use it for, well, everything? It's a super common thing we all do. There's this famous saying about a hammer and a nail that just hits it perfectly. In this explainer, we're going to dive into that simple idea, and I think you'll be surprised to see just how deep it goes. And here it is. This is the quote that really got the ball rolling, from the famous psychologist Abraham Maslow back in 1966. It's just so brilliant in its simplicity, right? It perfectly captures our habit of falling back on what we know, of using our one favorite tool for every single problem we face, whether it's the right fit or not. So this tendency actually has a formal name, the law of the instrument. It's what's known as a cognitive bias, basically a mental shortcut that our brains take that can sometimes lead us down the wrong path. You'll also hear it called Maslow's hammer, for obvious reasons, or in the tech world they call it the golden hammer, but they all point to the exact same idea. We get way too comfortable with our favorite tools. Okay, but here's where the story gets a little bit of a twist. Everyone associates Maslow with this idea, but its origins are actually a bit more complicated than you might think. So who really deserves the credit for coming up with it first? Well, check this out. It turns out a philosopher named Abraham Kaplan actually laid out the idea 2 full years before Maslow. And what's really fascinating is the slight difference between their takes. Kaplan's version is about the excitement of a new tool. You give a kid a hammer and suddenly everything needs hammering. Maslow's is more about the limitation of having only one tool. Both are getting at the same thing, but it was Kaplan who got there first. And you know what this timeline shows us? This is not a new idea at all. Long before any academics put a fancy name on it, people just got it. That old British slang, a Birmingham screwdriver, is just a hilarious way of saying you're using a hammer for everything. And that description from 1868 about the boy with a hammer, it's almost the exact same thing Kaplan said nearly 100 years later. This just proves that the law of the instrument isn't some modern discovery. It's a fundamental part of how we humans operate. So, we've traced the history of the idea. But this is way more than just a clever saying or an academic theory. The law of the instrument has very, very real consequences in all sorts of fields. Let's explore a few examples, shall we? First up, let's head to the high-stakes world of finance, where, using the wrong tool can have billion-dollar consequences. Yep, even the legendary investor Warren Buffett has warned people about this. He famously used the analogy to call out financial academics who got obsessed with their super complex mathematical models. For them, advanced math was the hammer, and they tried to apply it to every single market problem, often completely missing the simpler, more obvious, and frankly, more effective solutions right in front of them. Okay, next up, let's jump into a field where new tools are popping up all the time, but the old familiar ones can be surprisingly hard to let go of: software development. In the programming world, they have their own special name for this, the golden hammer. And it's considered an anti-pattern, which is basically code for a common practice you should absolutely avoid. This happens when a developer gets so good with one programming language that they just use it for everything, even when a different tool would be way better for the job. And this can lead to all sorts of problems: inefficient code, security holes, you name it. You can also find the law of the instrument in a field that has a huge impact on our personal well-being: psychiatry. Now, it's worth looking at a critical perspective here. Some observers argue that modern psychiatric drugs have been so effective that pharmacology has kind of become the discipline's go-to hammer. The concern raised by critics is that this might lead to an over-reliance on prescriptions as the first solution, possibly overshadowing other really valuable approaches like talk therapy or lifestyle changes. And finally, let's see how this exact same bias can show up at the very highest levels of policy and government. This is such a fascinating political science take on the law of the instrument. The idea here is that the very existence of a tool, in this case a government agency, creates its own demand. The agency becomes a hammer, and it starts searching for nails to hit. It can create this powerful incentive to find problems that need to be regulated, sometimes even when one doesn't really exist. So, the law of the instrument is a really powerful lens for understanding how we think, but it's not the only one. It's actually part of a whole family of these cognitive biases that can box us in. Let's quickly touch on a few. There's déformation professionnelle. That's just a fancy French term for when our job shapes our entire worldview, like a doctor who sees every problem as a medical issue.
Then there's functional fixedness, which is when we can't see other uses for an object, like, not thinking to use a heavy book as a doorstop. And of course, there's good old confirmation bias, where we only look for info that backs up what we already believe, which just makes us want to use our favorite hammer even more.
But what about the flip side? What happens when we don't have a particular tool? Well, the historian Robert Kagan came up with this brilliant corollary that turns Maslow's law completely on its head. Kagan used this idea to explain different approaches to foreign policy. He argued that after the Cold War, the U.S., with its gigantic military, a very big hammer, was more likely to see global problems as nails that needed military force. By contrast, Europe, with less military power, was way more inclined to see those exact same problems as things that could be solved with diplomacy or economic tools. It just goes to show you that the absence of a hammer can shape how we see the world just as much as its presence. And that brings us to the final and I think most important question, a question for all of us. What's the hammer in your personal or professional toolbox? Is it a certain skill, a piece of software, a particular way of arguing a point? And more importantly, are you unconsciously turning every problem you face into a nail just so you can use it? Really thinking about that is the first step to building a much bigger, more versatile, and way more effective toolbox.